also thank you very much for the invitation, in fact a generous permanent invitation, which I hope will still stand after my remarks this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, you all know that the word populism has become ubiquitous in global political discourse. It's not just actors on the right, but also plenty of actors on the left who are nowadays labeled as populists. Even poor Emmanuel Macron, at one point in 2017, was called a populist. It was said at the time that he was a populist of the extreme center. This raises, of course, the question of what exactly all these different populists are supposed to share, if it's not really policy content as such. Against this background, what I want to offer you this morning is, first of all, some observations about what a more precise definition or understanding of populism might look like. I secondly want to address the question of what populists in power tend to do, and I will focus on those situations where they really have power, so to pick up what Wolfgang was saying, situations where these are clearly the dominant actors and not just the junior partners. And then lastly, I'll say a few words about what you might call anti-populist strategies, which have been very tempting for liberal Democrats, but which I think we can actually be pretty sure about don't work. And then, if you don't mind, I'm also going to mark two differences with Wolfgang, because otherwise people are always going to say, oh, always the same, homogeneous discourse by these liberal elites up on the podium. So I'll try to pick a fight, to liven things up a little bit. So what is populism anyway? Well, the conventional wisdom today, of course, is that populists are those who criticize elites, criticize the establishment. On one level, it seems obvious. On another level, you might say, it's actually a very strange thought. Up until recently, any old civics textbook would have told you that being critical with the powerful, be it in politics, be it in the economy, be it in culture, be it anywhere really, is a sign of good democratic engagement. Come the 21st century, we're told day and night that people who are actually critically minded are somehow possibly dangerous for democracy. Clearly, things cannot be as simple as that. It's true that when populists are in opposition, they criticize sitting governments and other parties. But they also always do something else. They claim that they, and only they, represent what populists typically call the real people, or also the silent majority. This might not sound so bad. This is not immediately the same thing as racism, or let's say in the European context, a fanatical hatred of European integration. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, this claiming of a monopoly of representing the real people is bound to have two detrimental consequences for democracy. First, and perhaps rather obviously, populists will then also say that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. And this is never just a question about policy or even a disagreement about values, which after all is completely normal, ideally even productive in the democracy. No, populists in a sense always make it completely personal and completely moral. The issue is always from the get-go that the others are simply corrupt or, to coin a phrase, crooked characters. What Trump did in the presidential campaign 15-16 vis-a-vis his main opponent was, of course, in many ways extreme. But I don't think that it was an exception. All populists engage in that kind of rhetoric. Secondly, and maybe less obviously, populists are also going to say that all those citizens, all those, if you like, among the people themselves, who do not share their symbolic understanding of who constitutes the real people, and who therefore also doesn't support populists politically, that with all these citizens, you can put into doubt whether they truly belong to the people at all. Let me try to illustrate this perhaps less obvious point with two examples. Many of you will remember the, perhaps for many of you, traumatic night of Brexit, at the end of which Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party at that point, said that this had been, as he put it, a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that on one level, the 48% of British citizens who wanted to stay inside the European Union, well, on one level, aren't quite real, do not properly belong to the British, or maybe in Farage's specific case, the English people. Or an example from an otherwise pretty much unremarked on campaign speech by the man who now occupies the White House. In May 2016, Donald Trump said, I'm quoting from memory, "The most important thing is the unification of the people. And all the other people don't mean anything." I hope you can see where this is going. What matters about populism is not anti-elitism. Any of us can criticize elites. Doesn't mean we're right, but this is not in and of itself a danger for democracy. What matters about populism and is a danger for democracy is anti-pluralism. It's the tendency always to exclude others at the level of party politics, pretty obviously, less obviously at the level of the people themselves, where the populist leader basically decides these are the real people, and even if you happen to hold an American, a German, maybe a Brazilian passport, you still don't truly belong to the proper people. Allow me to draw out one implication of this account that might have particular relevance, certainly in the country where I live, as we are moving towards the next presidential election. If you find anything worthwhile in what I've been trying to get across so far, you might have thought that populists who lose elections or who don't gain overwhelming majorities have a pretty obvious problem. How can it be that on the one hand, they and only they represent the real people, and on the other hand, they don't win? It's a logical conundrum for them. There is a, I would say, typical, but not always to be found strategy with which populists who lose tend to address this problem. What they very often do is to essentially argue, look, by definition, if the silent majority were not silent, then we would always already be in power, because we are the only ones who represent the real majority. So if we don't win, maybe it's time to take another look at the silent majority, and what we find is that actually we're not talking about the silent majority, we're talking about the silenced majority. Somebody must have been manipulating something behind the scenes to prevent us from winning. It must have been rigged. Many of you will remember Trump's remarks in the run-up to the 2016 election, where he said, if I'm going to accept her win, I'll tell you at the time. Everybody understood what that really meant. There were some surveys that show that up to 70% of Trump supporters said, if Hillary Clinton wins this election, it must have been rigged. I think that's a bad number for any democracy, because it basically shows that a large part of the citizenry have decided that the institutions are so rotten that you basically can't trust them at all, and this distrust is then purposefully fed by populist politicians. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we can never criticize our electoral systems and institutions, especially but not only in the US. There's plenty to criticize, from campaign finance to gerrymandering and lots of other stuff we could talk about. But there's a difference, ladies and gentlemen, between a view that advances these general criticisms and somebody who in essence says, our system is rotten because I didn't win. And against this background, it's at least worrying, to put it mildly, that Trump is already building up a scenario leading up to 2020, where he says, well, lots of illegals could be voting again, And by the way, as he did most recently, you know, I'm friends with the military, have you noticed, and also the bikers. I'm not sure how the military feels about being put in the same category as, you know, the bikers, but never mind. So it's already, again, moving towards a scenario where an election can possibly be put into question. Swiftly on to the second chapter of my remarks. What do populists do when they get into power and really have power? A very common view, it seems to me, among broadly speaking liberals is that these actors have such horrendously simplistic ideas about policy that once they get into power, they're going to find that all their demagogic promises can't be kept, all their policies don't really work, so either they moderate, they become more rational somehow, or they stick with their crazy policies, which then automatically fail. Their supporters are going to see that things fail. So either way, the problem solves itself in one form or another. Or a kind of variation on this thought, all populists are against the elite. Once these actors are in power, they themselves, of course, have become the elite, so they cannot continue their anti-elite discourse, and they will have to abandon it, they will have to normalize somehow. So again, the problem solves itself. It's a very comforting thought, and I think it's profoundly mistaken. We have enough examples in our era of populists in power who not only can govern, but who can govern specifically as populists, which is to say, as actors who do not fundamentally recognize the legitimacy of an opposition. And to name just some of the most obvious ones in the European context, Hungary and Turkey. Well, Turkey is in Europe, but also Poland. If you want a left-wing example, I don't need to belabor the point which country in Latin America right now would be an obvious example of left-wing populism in power having led to an obvious disaster. But think also of maybe less obvious examples like Modi, who is not simply a kind of proponent of neoliberalism, but also has clearly defined the real Indian people along basically Hindu nationalist lines. What all these cases, it seems to me, show is that there is, by now, something that you might even perversely call a populist art of government, a set of techniques with which these politicians consolidate their power, and where, by the way, they can also learn from each other in terms of how you basically go about implementing this art. Allow me to just pick out a couple of these elements of this art of populist governance. The most obvious, I guess, is that all these populist actors are always going to push back against any criticism from independent institutions, be it constitutional courts, be it free media, by always saying, we are elected, you're not, and furthermore, we are the only ones who truly represent the people. This is by no means new. I'm not saying this is a great innovation. Napoleon III in the 19th century pretty much already said the same thing about the French press that criticized him. But there are a couple of other things that arguably are more innovative. First, all these actors, where they've had enough power and countervailing forces were too weak, have essentially occupied, hijacked the state itself, have tried to replace what in theory at least should be non-partisan civil servants, bureaucrats, with partisan actors. And, this is crucial, always in the name of their basic claim of we are the only ones who represent the people. Because you're going to say lots of other parties kind of try to do that. It's not specifically populist. But they can do this quite openly with the argument that, look, the state is there for the people. We are the only ones who represent the people. So if we take the state, it's the people taking the state, and there's nothing illegitimate about that. Second element, mass clientelism. Again, you're going to say plenty of parties engage in mass clientelism, not specifically populist. True. But again, populists are going to do this with a specific kind of claim. Remember that from the get-go, not all citizens are the people. Only some people are the real people. So if only some people get benefits, bureaucratic favors, and so on, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's exactly how things should be. Thirdly, and perhaps rather obviously, if there is pushback, if there is protest from civil society against these populist governments, I think by now it's clear that all of them tend to follow a playbook that was arguably first worked out by Vladimir Putin. Whenever people appear on the streets to speak out against populist governments are going to say, these aren't really citizens protesting against us. What you see out there, of course, has all been paid for, manipulated, engineered by outside forces. And then, you can draw on a wide range of usual suspects. It's the CIA. George Soros is always a favorite in these contexts. But really, there are no limits to creativity. Some of you may remember the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, people protesting against the restructuring of the area around Taksim Square by Erdogan. What did the Turkish government inform us of kindly? Of course, they came out and said, look, these aren't real citizens protesting against this policy. Everything has been organized, obviously, by Lufthansa, the German airline. Why? Because Erdogan was, of course, also building this fantastic new airport, which was giving another boost to Turkish Airlines, which, as Morgan Freeman is telling us in all these great ads, is a fantastic airline anyway. So Lufthansa was really concerned and hence paid all these people to come out. Notice how, again, beyond the obvious realpolitik element here, there is a symbolic dimension why populist politicians have to do this. If you say, we and only we represent the people, by definition it cannot be true that other people are really against you. So you have to also morally and symbolically delegitimate protests as much as possible. And maybe it's worth belaboring the point that, of course, it's entirely legitimate for governments to push back against the pushback and to say, look, we're elected. You're just demonstrators. Of course you can voice your dissatisfaction, but if you want something radically different, you got to wait for the next election. And by the way, these are the justifications for our policies. That's completely normal democratic politics. But if a person in response to protest says, or rather tweets, that these are all paid-up activists, as Trump did, that is not a normal democratic reaction, because you are basically saying there's nothing for us to discuss. I'm not even going to justify my policies to you because I don't recognize you as legitimate actors. You are just basically fake citizens out there who don't represent anything or any legitimate opposition. All right, swiftly on to my very last chapter. I just want to pick out what I take to have been two very typical ways in which, broadly speaking, liberals have tended to react to populism that I think can be highly problematic. First, if you are confronted with, let's say, a president who lies at least once a day, might sound familiar to you as well, it becomes very tempting for liberals to say, look, the situation is obvious. We have the truth. We have rationality. They always do fake news. They're always lying. It's always demagogues and so on. I mean, if you just need to, open the New York Times any day of the week and, you have a pop-up that says, if you care about the truth, subscribe today. And of course, the truth is always 40% cheaper, every time you click on this, thing. It's very tempting to go down this road. But where is it going to lead us? I think it's going to lead us to a distinctly technocratic stance. By technocracy, for shorthand, I mean actors who say there's really only one rational policy solution. If you disagree, you basically reveal yourself to be irrational, you haven't understood the complexity of today's world, there's really nothing for us to discuss, also there's nothing to debate in parliaments, there's only one rational solution that has to go through. Why is that so problematic? Well, it's partly problematic because it provides a great opening for populists to come back and say, what do you mean there's only one solution? Where are the people in this? We thought democracy was about choices. So if in doubt, it's likely to embolden populists further. And what's going to happen next? If populists become stronger, technocrats are going to become even more technocratic because they're going to say, look, you give people a choice, they bring crazy people to power. So we should ideally give people even less of a choice. You know, more gatekeepers, more restraints on what we throw open to democratic decision making. And guess what? If technocrats become stronger, the populists become stronger again. So we're caught in a complete vicious circle, potentially. And the irony is also that while this might look like now like, oh, we have two extremes, technocracy against populism, ultimately these two stances actually have one important thing in common, because they are both forms of anti-pluralism. The technocrat says only one rational solution, nothing to debate. The populist says only one real people, only we represented. If you disagree, you're a traitor to the people, nothing for us to discuss. Whereas I would hold that basically normal democracy happens in between, where you have choices, where you recognize the legitimacy of adversaries, but where you also basically accept the point that democracy, as shocking as it might sound, isn't really about truth. It's about different opinions that obviously have to be constrained by facts, but these are situations where we can legitimately disagree. Which brings me to my very last point. Especially, but not only, if you follow political discourse in the United States today, of course you are confronted with an endless series of lamentations about polarization. Oh, our society is so divided. It's particularly culturally divided between, you know, flyover country and the bi-coastal liberal elites. And this is terrible. And we need sort of a healing of these divisions. And ideally, we're going to have candidates for 2020 who are quasi-therapists who can heal us. I mean, wait a minute. Division in and of itself, even polarization in and of itself, is not the end or even a threat to democracy. If we didn't have divisions in our societies, we actually wouldn't need democracy. If everything was always automatically consensus, why do we even have political struggles? They're completely legitimate, as long as the adversaries recognize each other as legitimate, which is, if you find anything worthwhile in what I've been trying to say, is precisely what populists do not do. But division in and of itself is not the problem. A further problem then arises if one gives in to the temptation of buying the argument that ultimately all these divisions are really cultural or are about ways of life. People very often nowadays say, look, the problem is with these arrogant liberals, you know, who are really, of course, condescending towards rural America, you know, who make fun of, you know, Appalachian hicks, hillbillies, all these kinds of things. And by now, plenty of liberals have said, yes, mea culpa, I'm now going on what sometimes is ridiculed as a Trump safari. So, you know, you go to these places, you look at the, you know, the native population, and pretend to be very sympathetic and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that cultural differences don't matter. I'm not saying that everything can be reduced to economics. My plea, though, is to be much more careful with these cultural interpretations. First of all, I think it's very doubtful whether many people actually truly, in their lived experience, encounter forms of disrespect like the ones I've just presented to you. What they do encounter for sure is something else. They encounter talk radio and Fox and all these other great media organizations which day and night tell them that they are being disrespected. Because it turns out polarization is also big business. And it feeds on itself and it creates the very divisions of which it then lives. Secondly, lots of takes or interpretations of so-called left-behind places are still much better understood through basic socioeconomic factors. What's typical of left-behind places, at least in the United States? Well, to begin with, it's very difficult to get to them. It's partly the deregulation of the American airline industry, which led to a situation where to get to these rural places is enormously expensive, sometimes more expensive than to fly across the Atlantic. What also led to them being left behind are basic regulatory decisions, economic decisions about basically the end of real community banking, which used to play a very important role in these sorts of places. What also is important is, to put it very bluntly, but I think not inaccurately, that local economic actors did a great job in terms of lobbying to convince people that we all share a certain form of life. So, prime example, a place like West Virginia, where 30 years ago people would have said, look, I'm a coal miner, but my kids should not be coal miners because this is an incredibly dangerous and unhealthy thing to do. Then lobbying organizations come on the scene and they say, we're all friends of coal. You know, this is our common way of life. Never mind the owners don't of course actually work in these places or even live in these places. But this is our way of life. And it's the arrogant liberals, the Obama environmental protection guys who come and attack our way of life. And once, you know, you reframe things like this, once you take out what would have been obvious even 30 and 40 years ago, that, you know, here is whatever, the coal miners union, and the owners are actually our enemies on a certain level, once you reframe things in the right kind of way, the overall constellations change. And all I'm saying is that we should not too quickly buy into these narratives about cultural divisions. Okay, if I may, just two things to maybe open up a debate among us. So I completely agree on how you describe the importance of new cleavages. The one thing I would slightly push back on is this. How exactly do we describe what some of these positions amount to? You said it's ideal types, it's not meant to be faithful to any, you know, obvious empirical reality. But if we use, in my view, very loaded terms like open borders, I think, again, we should be careful. At least I am not aware of any political party in the Western world that is of any consequence that actually advocates anything that could meaningfully be described as open borders. German Greens don't say, let's, you know, basically abolish the German nation state right now for good. And I partly worry about this because it can lead to a kind of fake equidistance, you know, where the reasonable centrist says, well, of course I'm against open borders, but I'm also against, you know, the racists on the other side. But the one position, as far as I can see, doesn't really exist. Nobody really says, let's abolish borders entirely. For that matter, actually also nobody really says globalization is about global justice. As far as I remember, globalization was always justified in the name of the national interest. People said, you know, this is great for everybody. Or they said, like Tony Blair, we have to do this anyway. You know, debating globalization is like debating whether fall should follow summer, nothing we can do about it, we have to adapt it. But as far as I remember, nobody really gave a normative story about, oh, this is sort of going to be great for, you know, every human being around the world. Maybe you see it differently, but that's where I would be somewhat careful, just in terms of how we describe this new and emerging landscape. So I'm not entirely sure I've succeeded in picking a fight, but that's the best I can do for now. Thank you.